On April 26, 2002, 23-year-old Stephanie Bennett parked her car outside of her apartment complex in Raleigh, North Carolina. Stephanie was worn out from a long week at work, and so she was looking forward to relaxing and spending time with her friends over this weekend. She grabbed her purse off the passenger seat, got out of her car, and began walking towards her apartment. Stephanie was dressed in business casual work clothes. She had shoulder-length brown hair, brown eyes, and a huge smile. Stephanie's friends said she looked like she could play the perfect girl next door on a TV show. It was a beautiful spring evening in Raleigh, about 65 degrees Fahrenheit, and Stephanie saw a bunch of people out by the lake that was only about 100 yards from her apartment building. Stephanie just continued walking towards the lake, and as she did, she saw all these people out having fun and walking around and jogging with their dogs. Most of the people were Stephanie's neighbors, or they lived in the apartments just on the other side of the woods that were next to her apartment complex. And while Stephanie loved seeing all the familiar faces out there by the lake, who she really liked seeing were all the dogs. And that evening, Stephanie saw a dog she thought looked particularly happy. A big black and brown Rottweiler trotting in front of its owner with its tongue hanging out of its mouth. Stephanie smiled wide and walked over to the owner and the dog, and she leaned down and said hello to the dog. Then after that, she said hello to a couple of her neighbors who were nearby, and then finally she just turned and headed towards her first floor apartment. Stephanie stepped inside and found her two roommates waiting for her on the couch. The three women had been friends for years, and they still spent as much time together as they could, even though their lives had gotten really busy with work and with boyfriends. Stephanie told her roommates she'd be back in a couple of minutes, and then she went to her bedroom. There, she changed out of her work clothes and put on a t-shirt and jeans. It was Friday, but she and her roommates did not have any big plans. They were just going to hang out at home together. After getting changed, Stephanie grabbed the cordless phone off her bedside table and she called her boyfriend, Walter Robinson. Walter and Stephanie had been together for 4 years, and they were planning on getting married someday. Walter had even bought Stephanie a promise ring, which is a piece of jewelry that typically precedes an engagement ring. Walter picked up the phone on the other end, and he and Stephanie talked about how their days had gone. Stephanie's face lit up whenever she talked to Walter, and she was always happiest when she was with him. But at the time, they couldn't really be together nearly as much as they wanted to because Walter had moved to South Carolina for grad school. They were only about a 4-hour drive from each other, and they would go back and forth to see each other all the time. But that wasn't enough for Stephanie. She wanted to live with Walter and be with him all the time. So recently, she had made the decision to move to South Carolina as well. And she and Walter had already begun looking for an apartment they could share. On the phone, Stephanie told Walter how much she missed him, and he reminded her that she would be in South Carolina before she knew it, and everything would be perfect. Stephanie told Walter that she loved him and then hung up the phone. She was a bit sad when she had to say goodbye, but her roommates were waiting for her in the living room, and they could always cheer her up. That night, Stephanie and her roommates ate dinner, they watched TV, and basically just made each other laugh for hours. Stephanie knew her friends were going to miss her when she moved to South Carolina, but they were also really excited that she was about to take this next big step in her life. A few hours later, Stephanie and her roommates were still sitting in the living room when there was a knock at the door. They weren't expecting anyone, but they lived in the type of apartment complex where neighbors would sometimes drop by to borrow things like sugar or laundry detergent. So Stephanie got off the couch and walked over to the door and opened it up. And standing on the other side was one of her neighbors, a middle-aged guy she knew pretty well, and he looked very shaken. Stephanie's roommates joined Stephanie at the door to see what was going on. Stephanie asked the neighbor if everything was okay, and the man just shook his head and said no. He said he had been walking by outside when he saw something moving in their bushes. It was dark out, and the lights at the apartment were not very bright, so at first he thought it might just be an animal. But as he got closer, he said he saw a man in a hooded sweatshirt and that the man's face was pressed up against Stephanie's bedroom window. When the neighbor had called out to him, this Peeping Tom had run off, so the neighbor didn't get a good look at him. When Stephanie heard this, she felt a chill run down her spine. Earlier that night, she'd been in her room taking off her work clothes, and she pictured this guy in this hooded sweatshirt just standing there watching her. The neighbor told them he had reported the incident to the apartment manager, but he said Stephanie and her roommates really needed to be extra careful to always lock their doors and keep their blinds closed. They thanked the neighbor for letting them know, and then as soon as he left, Stephanie shut and locked the door. Then the three roommates just stood there in the living room, kind of stunned by what they had just learned. They knew their apartments were not the nicest place to live or anything, but they'd always felt safe here. Now they had to worry about some pervert peeking into their windows and trying to watch them undress. A few minutes later, Stephanie went back into her bedroom. Immediately, she adjusted the blinds on the window so nobody would be able to look in from the outside. Then she thought about maybe telling her boyfriend, Walter, or her dad about what had just happened. She knew they both prided themselves on being strong Southern gentlemen who protected women, but in this case, Stephanie felt like there really wasn't anything either of them could do. The incident had already been reported, and knowing about it would just make her father and Walter angry and upset. And so Stephanie told herself everything would be fine, and in just a couple of months, she'd be long gone to South Carolina, far away from this apartment and the creep who tried to spy on her. On May 20th, 2002, so almost a month after the Peeping Tom incident, Stephanie was getting back home from work again. She got out of her car and she saw people walking around the lake like usual, but this night she didn't stop to talk to any dogs or any of her neighbors. Instead, she went straight to her apartment. The truth was, Stephanie had been feeling anxious and upset all day. The weekend before, she had gone to South Carolina to see her boyfriend, Walter, and it was the happiest she had been in weeks because they had found the perfect apartment. But when it was time for her to drive back home, Stephanie had broken down in tears and told Walter that she just wanted to stay with him. She didn't want to leave. He said he felt the same way, but he reminded her that she'd be back here for good in only a month, and that the time between now and then would fly by. Stephanie knew he was right, but she still felt like every day she spent in Raleigh was a day she wasn't as happy as she could be. And so Stephanie walked into her apartment and quickly closed and locked the door behind her, and right away she had to admit to herself that there was actually another reason she was feeling so anxious. Both of her roommates were out of town, and since she'd learned about the Peeping Tom a month earlier, she had hated being alone in this apartment. Without her roommates there, the place just felt empty. It felt too quiet. So Stephanie turned on the TV just for some background noise. Then she made herself dinner, sat down on the couch, and watched TV while she ate. At about 8 p.m., so a couple of hours after she'd gotten home, Stephanie called Walter from the living room. And they talked about all the things they were going to put in their new apartment to make it really feel like home. Talking to Walter definitely cheered Stephanie up, but she was still dreading sleeping in her apartment by herself. So after she hung up with her boyfriend, Stephanie made herself a cup of tea, which she'd always been told was good to calm the nerves. She took her tea into the bedroom, but left her bedroom door open a crack. She just wanted to make sure she could hear any noises coming from other parts of her apartment. Stephanie then put her cup of tea down on the bedside table and then glanced over at the window to make sure the blinds were still closed. When she saw they were, she felt comfortable, so she got undressed, put on a nightgown, and climbed into bed. Then she reached over and took a sip of her tea, and then picked up a book and read for a bit. After finally feeling relaxed, Stephanie put the book down, flipped off the light, and began to fall asleep. The following afternoon, Stephanie's boyfriend, Walter, came out of one of his grad school classes and immediately began scrolling through his contact list on his phone. Walter and Stephanie talked almost every morning before she went to work and he went to class. But that morning, Stephanie had not answered her phone when he called. Walter hadn't thought much about it. There was a chance that maybe Stephanie had been getting ready for work or that she'd gone in early. But Walter had tried calling a few more times since then, and he had sent Stephanie a couple of emails, but he still hadn't heard back. Walter was getting worried. It was just weird for Stephanie not to respond to him at all. After scrolling for a minute, Walter finally found the number for one of Stephanie's roommates on his phone. Then he walked out of the building and called the friend while he headed to his car. Walter told the roommate what was going on, and the roommate said that Stephanie hadn't answered her phone when she called either, and so the roommate said that she was worried too. She told Walter she was out of town right now, but she'd call their apartment manager, and the manager could at least go by their place to just see if Stephanie was at home. Walter thanked the roommate and then tried to convince himself that everything was going to be okay. At 3:30 p.m., the apartment manager approached Stephanie's door. Stephanie's roommate had given the apartment manager permission to unlock the apartment and go inside. And so, after knocking and not getting an answer, the apartment manager pulled out a key and opened up the door and walked into the living room. And right away, nothing looked out of the ordinary. So she called out to see if anybody was home, but the place was silent. So the manager walked into the hallway that led to each of the 3 bedrooms. Stephanie's bedroom door was closed, but the door across the hall was open just a crack. So the manager walked down the hallway and looked through that crack into that room, and what she saw caused her to turn and run down the hall screaming. And then once she got outside, she frantically pulled out her phone and called 911. About 10 minutes after that 911 call, Lieutenant Chris Morgan, head of the Violent Crimes Task Force in Raleigh, put on his white fedora hat and walked out of his office. Lieutenant Morgan was a big guy, and he seemed even bigger when he spoke in his booming southern drawl. But it was really that white fedora, with its soft brim and indented crown, that made people always notice him wherever he went. In truth, Morgan had begun wearing the hat when he was a young investigator because he liked how it looked. It was a throwback to lawmen from an earlier time. But Morgan had proven to be a highly skilled detective, and the more crimes he solved, the more attached he became to this white hat. Over time, Morgan had started to see the hat as some kind of a magical charm that helped him close case after case. A little before 4 p.m., Morgan arrived at Stephanie's apartment. Other officers and crime scene analysts were already hard at work. One of the officers greeted the lieutenant and then quickly ushered him down the hallway to one of the bedrooms. Morgan stepped inside the bedroom and looked down at the floor. Right away, he took up his fedora and stood there respectfully for a full minute, not moving or talking. Everyone who worked with Morgan knew that his big outward persona was actually just a small part of who he was. Inside, Morgan was a highly empathetic person, and it was his empathy that really made him such a great cop. He had worked violent crimes for years, but he still felt heartbroken every time he saw a victim. Violent crimes were an attack on his community and a robbery of everything the victim would have experienced in their life. After his moment of silence was over, Morgan put his hat back on and crouched down to the floor. He was looking at one of the most gruesome crime scenes he'd ever witnessed. The young woman lying there had already been identified as Stephanie Bennett, and Stephanie was lying on her back, naked, with her arms and legs stretched out to the sides. There were ligature marks on her wrists and ankles from where she had clearly been tied up. There was a dark purple mark around her neck, and there was a pair of blue women's underwear stuffed inside of her mouth. Lieutenant Morgan was sure the mark on Stephanie's neck meant she had been strangled to death, but Morgan just couldn't get over how pronounced that mark on her neck was. Whoever had done this to Stephanie had inflicted as much pain on her as they possibly could. Then Lieutenant Morgan called over one of the crime scene analysts. He wanted confirmation of something he already knew to be true. He told the analyst he believed there were clear signs of sexual assault, and the analyst agreed. Morgan stood up. He felt angry and sick, but he knew that in the case of sexual assault, there would be DNA samples from the attacker on the victim's body, and that was evidence Morgan could use to catch the person who did this. Looking around the room, Morgan saw that the window was closed, but the window screen had been removed. He thought there was a chance that that window was how the killer had entered the apartment. But Morgan also noticed several photos on the wall in this room that were of a young woman who was not Stephanie, so he assumed that this was actually not Stephanie's bedroom. So Lieutenant Morgan walked to the bedroom across the hall, and right away he saw pictures of Stephanie and her friends and family in there, so he knew this was her room. And so for some reason, the killer had carried out their attack on Stephanie in her roommate's bedroom. Morgan thought, perhaps the killer just wanted to stay close to their exit route, which would be through the roommate's window. Morgan walked around Stephanie's bedroom, and the way it was decorated really hit him hard. There were stuffed animals on the bed and Harry Potter books on the shelves. All he could think was that Stephanie was barely older than a kid, and some horrible person had crept in here and taken everything from her. Morgan also started thinking about all the apartment complexes near the lake. They were home to a lot of other young women like Stephanie, so Morgan really had to act fast to make sure this did not happen to anyone else. At 9 a.m. the following morning, Lieutenant Morgan and his investigative team were back at Stephanie's apartment complex. They had only wrapped up their initial search a few hours earlier, so most of them had barely slept. but nobody would know that from looking at Morgan. He was full of energy when he walked around the complex to meet up with Stephanie's neighbors. He wanted to know if anybody had seen or heard something on the night of the murder. But nobody had noticed anything strange. In fact, it had been so quiet that the neighbors who shared a wall with Stephanie's bedroom said they hadn't heard any noise at all. Morgan had his team collect information on everybody they could find at the apartment complex. But because of the nature of the crime, the sexual assault and very violent murder, he figured they were looking for a man. Normally, Morgan's first suspect would have been Stephanie's boyfriend, Walter, because in the United States, almost 35% of female murder victims are killed by an intimate partner. But the night before, Morgan had contacted Walter in South Carolina, and the young man had completely broken down on the phone when he heard about what happened to his girlfriend. And Morgan's team was quickly able to locate multiple witnesses who had been with Walter at the time of the murder. So Morgan turned his attention to the men in Stephanie's apartment complex, and he found that almost every man his team spoke to was willing to provide DNA samples. In fact, just about everybody who had known Stephanie, even if they had barely known her, told police they would do whatever it took to help police find her killer. They just kept saying how kind Stephanie had been to everyone, that this just didn't make any sense. While members of Morgan's team collected DNA samples from Stephanie's male neighbors, Morgan met with residents who had not been home when police first arrived. And Morgan pretty quickly found someone who had information that could help. It was the neighbor who had warned Stephanie and her roommates about the Peeping Tom a month earlier. The neighbor recounted his story about seeing the Peeping Tom, but as hard as he tried, he really could not give Morgan much of a description. Then, Morgan spoke to another resident, a man with a very heavy Czech accent, who claimed to have also seen the Peeping Tom. But, just like Stephanie's neighbor, the guy with the heavy Czech accent really did not get a good look at him. He just said the guy at Stephanie's window appeared to be white, so Caucasian, he was pretty big, and he appeared to have short hair. Morgan thanked both of the men for their help, because even without a detailed description from either one of them, they had actually given investigators a major lead here. And Morgan thought the killer could have been spying on Stephanie through her window for weeks or months, picturing her as their victim and devising their plan. So Morgan rounded up his team and told them to start looking for anyone who might fit the limited description they had of this Peeping Tom. Then, Morgan returned to Stephanie's apartment to see if maybe there was anything he might have missed. But what Morgan didn't know was someone was watching him while he was doing this. They were hidden in the shadows of the parking lot, and they could see everything that was going on. After speaking to Stephanie's neighbors, Lieutenant Morgan had focused his investigation on finding this Peeping Tom. But so far, police had come up empty in their search. Lieutenant Morgan encouraged his team to please remain patient because he believed the Peeping Tom would slip up and they would eventually get him. Because Morgan was convinced this Peeping Tom would not just stop with Stephanie, they would start looking for another victim. So Morgan had made sure to have officers on site at Stephanie's apartment complex and the other complexes nearby in case this Peeping Tom started looking in other windows. On the night of June 3rd, so roughly 2 weeks after Stephanie was murdered, a young police officer was walking the grounds of one of the apartment complexes near Stephanie's. And suddenly, this officer heard something coming from the bushes a few yards away. The officer quickly crouched down behind a nearby wall so he'd be out of sight. And then the officer craned his neck around that wall and he focused on the bushes, and there he saw a man standing in them looking through an apartment window. The young officer saw this man, this Peeping Tom, lean his face right up against the glass, and then he also saw this Peeping Tom undo his belt and then reach into his pants. The moment this happened, the young officer radioed for help and then got out from behind that wall and began sprinting towards this guy in the bushes. The Peeping Tom heard the officer, turned, and started to run. The young officer sprinted after him, but the Peeping Tom was fast. However, just then, 2 more officers came running out of the darkness from the other direction, and they leapt at this man and tackled him to the ground. The Peeping Tom tried to break free, but the officers kept him pinned down and got him handcuffed. The young officer who originally spotted the Peeping Tom eventually joined the other 2 officers totally out of breath, and then he called into the station and told Lieutenant Morgan they had finally caught the Peeping Tom. And as the officers led the Peeping Tom to a police cruiser, They had no idea there was somebody else nearby watching their every move. Later that night, the Peeping Tom sat in an interrogation room at the police station. In the hours following his arrest, police had been able to identify him as Christopher Campen. He was 34 years old, he had short hair that matched the description police had gotten, and he had an extensive criminal record. Christopher had been arrested multiple times on misdemeanor charges for, quote, secret peeping, end quote, also stalking, and also exposing himself. And those were all acts that police considered potential gateway crimes that could eventually lead someone to commit full-blown sexual assault or even murder. So, for the first time since Stephanie had been murdered, Lieutenant Morgan thought he had a real potential suspect here. Morgan stepped into the interrogation room and sat across from Christopher. Morgan took off his white fedora hat and put it down on the table, and then greeted Christopher in his booming voice. And that voice, and Morgan's sheer size, made Christopher immediately shift in his chair uncomfortably and look down at the floor. Morgan told Christopher that police knew all about his criminal history, and they knew that earlier that night he'd been spying on a young woman while she got into the shower. Then Morgan just sat back and stared at Christopher. And as he did, Christopher remained silent and just kept shifting around in his seat. Finally, Morgan just asked him if he knew Stephanie Bennett. Christopher immediately sat up straight in his chair, and a look of fear came across his face. He told Morgan he knew who Stephanie was. Basically everybody in Raleigh did, because the case was all over the news. But he said he actually didn't know her, and he didn't have anything to do with what had happened to her. Now, there was no denying what police had caught him doing that night, looking in the woman's window, but he said that did not mean he was also a murderer. Morgan nodded, and then asked Christopher some questions about his criminal history. But the more Christopher spoke, the more Lieutenant Morgan felt like something was off here. There was no question that everybody in the police department, including Morgan, hoped they had found Stephanie's killer when they brought Christopher in. After all, he was caught red-handed being a Peeping Tom. He also roughly fit the description of the man who had been seen watching Stephanie through her window, but Morgan had made a long, successful career out of reading people, and he was right way more often than he was wrong. And listening to Christopher, he just did not think this guy could be behind the absolutely horrific crime scene he saw in Stephanie's apartment. A lot of organization and planning had gone into Stephanie's murder. Her killer had clearly been calculated and patient, and they had not left any discernible fingerprints anywhere. But the way Christopher spoke seemed completely scattered, not calm or organized at all. Morgan knew others in the investigation would not want to hear the theory that had just crossed Morgan's mind, that there might be two different Peeping Toms in the apartment complexes near the lake, and that this one they had arrested was not the right one. It was not the murdering Peeping Tom. Still, Lieutenant Morgan was a strong believer in science, so that night, police still charged Christopher with secret peeping and resisting arrest, and officers swabbed his cheeks to obtain DNA samples. Now they would have to wait to see if Christopher's DNA matched the DNA found on Stephanie's body. It only took a few days for Lieutenant Morgan to be proven right about Christopher. The DNA samples did not match those found at the crime scene. Christopher was indeed a Peeping Tom, but he was not Stephanie's killer. Morgan, by this point, had been pretty sure that this would be the outcome, but he was still disappointed. He had stayed in close contact with Stephanie's family, and he had promised them that Stephanie's killer would be found. But now he was getting concerned, because they were weeks into this investigation, and he no longer had any legitimate leads. And not long after Christopher's DNA test results came in, Morgan got more bad news from the crime lab. The DNA samples found on Stephanie's body did not match any samples in the state or national DNA databases. In short, that meant that the one major piece of evidence investigators had found had not given them any idea who killed Stephanie. So Morgan went back to square one and just started re-interviewing residents at Stephanie's apartment complex. But he didn't discover anything that gave him the break in the case they desperately needed. On top of that, there was something else that kept gnawing at Morgan. almost every man who lived in the apartments had voluntarily provided DNA samples, but there were a few men who had refused. However, without just cause, Morgan couldn't force them to submit DNA samples. So he believed there was still a chance that someone who lived close to Stephanie was her killer. Police just needed something to point them in the right direction. They at least needed enough evidence to get a warrant to obtain the DNA samples they were missing. But after months of interviewing residents and monitoring the grounds, investigators still did not have anything to go on. And by the fall of 2002, Morgan knew the case was going cold. And as more time passed, he felt like he was failing Stephanie's family. Then 2002 came to an end, and then all of 2003 passed with no real progress on the case. Stephanie's story slowly disappeared from the media, and it almost seemed like the community had moved on. But Morgan was determined to keep the promise he'd made to Stephanie's family, even if he was not the one to solve Stephanie's murder. In April of 2004, almost 2 years after Stephanie's murder, Lieutenant Morgan called on Detective Ken Copeland to take over Stephanie's case. Copeland was a member of the Ha-Awa-Saponi Indian tribe, and he'd grown up in a rural area not far from Raleigh. He also was a former United States Marine who looked like he could punch a hole through a brick wall. But most importantly to Morgan, Detective Copeland was known around the department as the, quote, garbage man. Copeland was so detail-oriented that he would often find small pieces of evidence that other cops had just assumed were garbage. So Morgan knew that if anyone could discover something that he had missed, it would be Detective Copeland. After getting the assignment, Copeland immediately laid out a plan to re-interview as many people as he could at Stephanie's apartment complex who had been a part of the initial investigation. He hoped that somebody would have new information for him. The process was slow going, and getting people to help police again, years after the murder, was not always easy. But several residents did tell Copeland something that had not come up before. They said they remembered seeing someone that they didn't know who seemed to spend day after day after day just watching the police conduct their investigation during that initial investigation period. But nobody could give Copeland a decent description of this person because this person always seemed to be just out of sight or blending in with a crowd. Nothing Copeland heard was enough to give him a solid lead, but he was sure this was significant, and he wondered if maybe the killer had come back to the scene of the crime just to relish in what they had done. But even with this new information, Copeland did not rush to any conclusions. He was trying to rebuild this case from the ground up, and he was confident his method would pay off. And finally, in February of 2005, 10 months after Copeland had taken over the case, he caught a massive break. He was back at Stephanie's apartment complex to conduct another round of interviews when a man came running towards him, calling out in a strong Czech accent. The man was one of the people who had told police early on that he had seen the Peeping Tom by Stephanie's window. The man came up to Copeland and just started talking right away, sounding very excited. He said he had remembered something, and it was very important. In fact, the man couldn't believe it had taken this long for him to remember this. He told Copeland that when the Peeping Tom had run away from Stephanie's window, he'd headed towards the apartment complex that was just on the other side of the woods. Copeland felt a rush. Police had searched those apartments early on, but nothing had come of it, and Copeland had spent the bulk of his time focused on Stephanie's complex. Now suddenly, he had a strong feeling that he would find what he was looking for just beyond the woods. Copeland thanked the man with the Czech accent for his help and then headed toward the neighboring apartment complex. When he got there, he went right into the management office and he asked one question of the people in that office. Were there any residents in their building who made a practice out of spying on other residents? The people in the office didn't even hesitate. They said absolutely there was one person who did do that, and they pointed Copeland toward that person's apartment. Copeland's time as a U.S. Marine had enabled him to remain calm in even the most stressful situations. But in this moment, as he walked towards this apartment, he could feel his heart beating faster and faster. Copeland was sure that talking to whoever lived in this apartment would finally break this case wide open. Copeland finally arrived at the apartment, and after taking a deep breath, he knocked on the door. A moment later, the person who lived there answered, and they were clearly intimidated by how big Copeland was. But Copeland smiled, introduced himself, and showed his badge, and the person let him inside. Copeland didn't waste any time. He asked this person right off the bat if they knew anything about Stephanie Bennett's murder. And within minutes, Copeland knew the case had its first real suspect in years. After that meeting, Detective Copeland followed up on some of the information he had just gotten. Then he rushed back to the police station and told Lieutenant Morgan he was sure they had a lead that would finally pan out. Morgan felt a mix of relief and urgency. Detective Copeland, the garbage man, had come through just like Morgan had hoped. But Morgan knew they had to make sure they had enough evidence to convict their new suspect in court. Copeland had gathered a lot of information that day, and so with Morgan's help, they were able to secure warrants that would allow police to conduct surveillance on their suspect and to obtain a DNA sample without the suspect's cooperation. After visiting the apartments near Stephanie's, Copeland had been trying to secure a DNA sample from their new suspect. But this suspect had stayed one step ahead of Copeland. This man somehow knew he was being pursued, and he seemed to be a master at covering his tracks. When the suspect went to restaurants, he always ate finger foods so he wouldn't leave prints on forks or knives. He also pocketed any straws he used, and he flushed his napkins down the toilet. At work, he wiped down his computer and desk every day, and he never disposed of anything in the trash can by his desk or in the dumpster outside the building. Detective Copeland knew the suspect was beating him, but he also knew the suspect's one small weakness. The man had a sweet tooth. The suspect's boss had told Copeland that the man often ate ice cream and other snacks at work, so Copeland had come up with a last-ditch effort to get a DNA sample. He had asked the suspect's boss to arrange a lunch for her entire department, and he had asked the boss to do something important at that lunch. So, on September 15th, 2005, almost 3.5 years after Stephanie's murder, 2 members of Copeland's team were dressed in plain clothes, sitting inside of a Golden Corral restaurant. The officers watched from across the restaurant as the suspect's boss walked up to the buffet line and grabbed a tray and put some banana pudding on it. The tray trembled in the boss's hands because she was so nervous, but she did the very important thing Copeland had asked her to do. She put that dessert tray right on the table in front of the suspect, and the suspect took the bait. They grabbed a banana pudding, and then he picked up a fork and began eating. After a few bites, the suspect wiped the fork down with a napkin and put the napkin in his pocket, but the suspect left the fork on the table. Minutes later, the suspect walked out of the restaurant, and at that point, the 2 plainclothes officers rushed over to the table and bagged the fork as evidence. And that fork would provide a DNA sample that would eventually allow police to determine who had killed Stephanie. Based on interviews, DNA samples, and evidence found at the crime scene, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Stephanie Bennett on the night of May 20th and the early morning of May 21st in 2002. The sun was shining bright when the killer walked from his apartment complex over to Stephanie's. He was carrying a duffel bag on his shoulder, he tucked his long hair under the hood of his black sweatshirt, and he kept his hands in his sweatshirt pocket so nobody would see the latex gloves he was wearing. The killer scanned the grounds to make sure nobody was nearby, and he saw that everything was clear. He'd chosen this time to come because he knew most people would still be at work and not out walking on the footpaths near the lake. The killer moved quickly towards the high bushes in front of Stephanie's roommate's bedroom window. He crouched down, climbed through the bushes, and then removed the window screen. The window itself was locked, but the killer knew it was not that secure. And so he grabbed the bottom of the window with his gloved hands, used all of his strength, and he forced it open. Once it was open, the killer climbed into the roommate's bedroom and closed the window behind him. He walked across the bedroom, opened the door halfway, and looked across the hall at Stephanie's room. The door was closed. Satisfied, the killer turned back around and went inside of one of the roommate's closets and once he was inside, he positioned the door so it was barely open a crack so he could still listen to what was going on in the apartment. And then the killer put his bag on the closet floor, he sat down, and he waited for hours. Finally, at about 6 p.m., the killer heard the front door unlock and open. He held his breath. He knew he still had to wait just a bit longer. The killer heard the TV turn on in the living room, then he smelled food cooking in the kitchen, and he listened as Stephanie spoke on the phone. All the while, the killer just kept breathing slowly so he would stay calm and patient. Finally, hours after Stephanie had gotten home, the killer heard her coming down the hall. From his spot in the closet, he not only could see Stephanie walk into her bedroom, but he could see her in the bedroom. She left her bedroom door open. So the killer watched Stephanie as she got undressed and put on her nightgown. Then he saw Stephanie grab a book and get under her covers, and he waited while she read. Then the killer saw the light go off in Stephanie's bedroom, and he felt a jolt of adrenaline. It was time to go. The killer grabbed his bag, stepped out of the closet, and then placed the bag down right in the middle of the bedroom floor. Then he rushed out of the room, he went across the hall, he slammed open Stephanie's door, and he leapt onto the bed, pinning Stephanie down. Stephanie was in complete shock and terror, but the killer just pushed one hand over her mouth to keep her quiet, and he used the other hand to hit her multiple times. Stephanie was stunned and already bleeding. With one hand continuing to cover Stephanie's mouth, the killer pulled her off of her bed and dragged her across the hall into her roommate's bedroom where he had left the bag. Stephanie fought back and tried to break free, but the killer was so strong and he held her down and managed somehow to keep her totally silent. The killer dragged Stephanie into the center of the room, and then he reached over into his bag and took out several pieces of rope. And then using that rope, the killer quickly bound Stephanie's wrists behind her back, and then he pushed her onto the ground, and then he used the other piece of rope to bind her ankles, and then once she was all tied up, he removed all of her clothing, and then he shoved her underwear into her mouth to gag her. Then the killer left Stephanie on the floor of the roommate's bedroom, and then the killer crossed the hallway back into Stephanie's bedroom. And there, the killer went into Stephanie's dresser and looked through her clothes and eventually removed a piece of Stephanie's underwear. This would be his trophy. After that, the killer walked out of Stephanie's room, closed the door, and then went back into the room where Stephanie was bound and gagged on the ground. The killer placed his trophy inside of his bag and then turned his attention to Stephanie. The killer raped Stephanie. And then after he was done, he reached into his bag again and pulled out a long metal wire. He leaned over Stephanie, wrapped that wire around her neck, and slowly strangled her to death. After she was dead, the killer just stared at Stephanie's body for a whole minute. Then he threw the wire back into his bag and also cut the restraints off of her wrists and ankles and threw that rope back into the bag as well. Then the killer picked up the bag, climbed back out the window he had come in through, and ran across the dark apartment complex towards the woods. A few minutes later, he arrived at his apartment, he opened the door, and the second he did, he was greeted by his very friendly and extremely happy-looking black and brown Rottweiler. It would turn out that Stephanie's murderer was someone she had met before, but only very briefly. His name was Drew Planton, and he was the owner of that very happy-looking Rottweiler that Stephanie had noticed and gone up to and crouched down and pet after coming home from work about a month before her murder. And that was it. That was Stephanie's entire connection to Drew. But for Drew, that small chance encounter had been enough. And not long after that interaction, Drew had begun to stalk Stephanie and spy on her through her windows when she was in her bedroom. And finally, Drew had decided Stephanie would be his next murder victim. Because it would also turn out that Drew Planton had very likely killed before. Police would discover that years earlier, he had very likely murdered an exotic dancer in Lansing, Michigan, but the case had gone unsolved. However, everybody involved in that case fully believed Drew was the killer. Drew was not on Lieutenant Morgan and his team's radar at first because he had moved out of the apartment complex near Stephanie's not long after the murder, and he didn't really fit the description of the Peeping Tom they had been given. He was tall, but he was gangly and had long, shaggy hair. Also, Drew was a well-respected chemist in Raleigh who did not seem to fit the initial criminal profile. But everything changed when the garbage man, Detective Copeland, took over. When Copeland learned that the killer had most likely lived in the apartment complex near Stephanie's, and that someone who Stephanie's neighbors didn't recognize had been watching the police from a distance, he had an idea. Copeland did not like to stereotype people, but as someone who'd grown up in the rural South, he believed every community had a busybody who made it their job to know everybody else's business. So he went to the apartment complex where he believed the killer lived, and he asked the office workers which resident spent the most of their time keeping tabs on their neighbors. And they immediately pointed him to one of the residents' apartments. But Copeland was not talking to the killer inside of that apartment. He was talking to a woman who regularly spied on her neighbors and who knew everything about all of them. And it turned out she was the person who had spent a lot of time lurking around the apartment complexes near the lake, watching the police investigation unfold. And that woman told Copeland he really needed to talk to Drew Planton, a man who used to live in an apartment close to hers and who had a pet Rottweiler. She said Drew had always creeped her out, but more importantly, she had seen him several times before the murder, hanging around near the apartment where Stephanie would be killed. And Copeland got confirmation from a few of Stephanie's neighbors, including the man with the heavy Czech accent, that they had often seen a man walking a Rottweiler around their apartment complex, and there was a chance that man could have been the Peeping Tom they saw outside of Stephanie's window. So Copeland came to believe that Drew was very likely Stephanie's killer. Drew was able to elude police for a while, but eventually his love of sugar brought him down. Copeland knew nobody would eat banana pudding with their hands, so he set up his sting operation with Drew's boss, and sure enough, a partial DNA sample taken from the fork Drew used to eat the pudding showed that he was most likely Stephanie's killer. And that was enough to convince Drew's boss to continue helping the police, and she would ultimately secure a pair of gloves Drew had used at work before he could throw them away. And those gloves provided police with a more complete DNA sample that would be strong enough to hold up in court, and that did make it clear that Drew really had murdered Stephanie. In court, Drew Planton refused to walk, speak, or even open his eyes. He acted like he was in a totally catatonic state. But Drew was not catatonic, and ultimately he would commit suicide in jail before a verdict could be handed down. 2010, 18-year-old Renee Marsden was living in Sydney, Australia with her parents and her 3 siblings. Renee was a very outgoing person who had a big circle of friends, and she was also very close with her family, especially her mom, Teresa. Teresa had given birth to Renee when she was only 19 years old, and so now that Renee was a young woman, because of their closeness in ages, the two had become very close friends instead of mother and daughter. And so because of that dynamic, Renee found herself always going to her mother to tell her anything going on in her life. She was her confidant. And that year, something major had disrupted Renee's life, and so naturally she went to her mom and she told her about it. It would turn out Renee's boyfriend of nearly 2 years, who she was madly in love with, well, she discovered he was cheating on her and didn't actually even care about her. He had sent these text messages that basically said as much. And so she confronted her boyfriend with these text messages, and he denied ever sending them. He said, "Look, I've never cheated on you. I don't know where those came from. I promise I've been faithful to you this entire time." But Renee just wasn't buying it, and so she had felt forced to break up with him. And so Renee naturally had turned to her mother for comfort and guidance, but Teresa, all she could really offer her daughter was, to remind her that time heals all wounds, and that certainly someday you will meet the right person for you. And amazingly, only a couple of weeks after this very painful breakup, Renee came home from work one day and she walked into the house and she was all smiles. And considering how unbelievably depressed she had been over the last couple of weeks, this really stood out. And so when her mom saw her smiling and radiating happiness, she rushed over to her and said, "What's gotten into you? Why are you in such a good mood?" And Renee would tell her that, "Actually, I've met another guy." And so Teresa said, Who did you meet? Who is this person?" And she would tell her mom that his name is Braden Spiteri, he was 23 years old, and he was a graduate of the King's School, which is a really prestigious boys' school in Sydney, and his father was this really successful business person who owned this big construction company that he was set to inherit later on. And so she was just raving about how amazing this guy was, and Teresa was really happy. If nothing else, this was a very good distraction for her, and so she asked her daughter at some point, how'd you meet this guy? And Renee would tell her that Camilla had introduced them. Camilla Zaidan was Renee's best friend. They had met in high school. And Renee would explain to her mother that Braden was actually Camilla's ex-boyfriend, but they hadn't dated in a really long time, and there was no feelings between them. They were just friends at this point. And apparently, after Renee had this really painful breakup, Camilla had just felt bad for her, and so she had gone out and found the best possible match for Renee, which in her mind was this guy Braden. Teresa knew Camilla really well because she was always over the house, and she knew Teresa's intentions must have been good, but she's thinking to herself, this is bad news. You don't want to have best friends, one dating the ex-boyfriend of the other. It's just bad news waiting to happen. And so Teresa couldn't even help herself, and she says to her daughter, do you really think it's a good idea to be dating Camilla's ex-boyfriend? But Renee would tell her mom, look, Camilla was totally upfront with me. She just wants me to be happy. She thinks Braden is a good match for me. They don't have feelings anymore, not at all. She's totally in support. And so Teresa still very much had her doubts that this was a good idea. But she put those doubts aside, and instead she said, okay, well, can you show me a picture of Braden? Can I see what he looks like? And so Renee pulls out her phone and she finds a picture of Braden and she shows it to her mom. And right away, her mom is looking at this picture and seeing that Braden is a very handsome guy, big bright smile. But she sees in this picture, Camilla is very clearly laying on his shoulder like she is his girlfriend. And so again, Teresa's thinking to herself, this is not good. Someone is going to get hurt. But over the next couple of weeks and months, Renee and Braden texted each other all the time. I mean, Renee had her phone out basically 24/7 talking to Braden. The pair had made plans to meet up and see each other in person for the first time on several different occasions, but every single time they were set to go meet, one of them would have a conflict that would make it impossible to have this face-to-face meeting. And so before long, when they just could not get a meeting established, they kind of stopped trying to have face-to-face meetings. It was almost like they had built this really strong, flourishing relationship all via their phones, and it just was getting more and more awkward to actually go out and see each other in real life. It was just more comfortable doing it all on their phones. And so this digital-only relationship between Renee and Braden continued for almost a year until January of 2012, when something horrible happened. Braden was in a horrible motorcycle accident. He survived the accident, but his passenger, his best friend, this guy named Richie, who was riding right on the back of his motorcycle, he didn't survive. He was killed in the accident. And it was determined that Braden was driving recklessly, and so he was charged with manslaughter and convicted and sentenced to 2 years in prison. Even though Renee's mother, Teresa, was totally upset about this accident, I mean, she did understand someone had lost their life and now Braden was going to jail for 2 years. She understood the seriousness of this accident. But at the same time, there was a part of her, her motherly protective side of her, that was kind of relieved for her daughter. She figured with Braden being out of contact for 2 years in prison, that their relationship would end and Renee could go pursue somebody else who was not an ex-boyfriend of a close friend and was someone that she could actually see in person and not just have to text with all the time. But surprisingly, after Braden was transferred to Goulburn Prison, which is where he'd be serving his 2-year sentence, it's located about 2 hours to the south of Sydney, his family smuggled a phone somehow into this jail, and he was able to continue texting with Renee. And so after he was incarcerated, they just picked up their relationship like nothing had changed. Now, Renee's family did not like this development, and they told her as much. They thought this was a bad idea, that this was the wrong path for her, but Renee didn't care. She was totally in love. And in fact, over the first couple of weeks that he was in Goulburn Prison, their relationship only intensified. They actually agreed to get married as soon as he was released at the end of 2013. And in fact, Renee had already begun making wedding preparations. She had gone on eBay and found this beautiful tiara she would wear on her wedding day, and she had contracted a wedding photographer, and she had even contacted the Greek consulate to ask if it would be okay if Braden were allowed to enter their country, because they were planning to have their honeymoon in Greece, and Braden was going to be a convicted felon, and so she needed permission for him. But in August of 2013, just 2 months before Braden's expected release date, something changed. Renee's mother, Teresa, got a text message from Braden, something she had never gotten before, and it said, "You need to check on your daughter. She's talking about killing herself." And so Teresa is totally taken aback by this message, and she goes right into Renee's bedroom where she is sitting on her bed, and her mother sits down next to her and says, "Honey, are you okay? What's going on?" And Renee would look up at her mom and say, "Yeah, I'm fine. What's going on with you?" And then Teresa would hold out the phone and show her the text message from Braden. And as soon as Renee saw it, she kind of sighed and looked at her mom and said, "I'm not going to hurt myself. We just broke up. Our relationship is over." Teresa knew this was going to be an extremely hard stretch of time for her daughter with another painful breakup here. But at the same time, Teresa thought to herself, this is probably for the best. That relationship just had bad news written all over it from the start. And so now she can begin to heal and move forward with her life. And so Teresa and Renee would sit in the room for a while just chatting on the bed. And then eventually Renee would tell her mom that her plans that night were to go out with her friends and cut loose and kind of just forget about this whole thing. And so Teresa sat in her bedroom on her bed as her daughter stood in front of the mirror and got ready. And then once Renee was ready, she and her mom hugged and kissed. And then Renee told her mom she'd be back soon. And then she left the house. A few hours later, Teresa received a text message from her daughter, and it started with, "Mom, I love you so much, and I'm sorry for the pain I'm about to cause you. You can still talk to me though, just call out my name and I'll be there." Teresa read this message and didn't really know what to make of it. She knew her daughter was almost certainly very upset about this breakup, but she didn't really understand the context of this message, and so she called her daughter. She didn't pick up, so she called her again, and after that second time her daughter didn't answer, she sent her a text message that just said, "Please call me back." But she sat there kind of waiting for her daughter's call, but it never came. And so Teresa, starting to feel a little bit worried about her daughter, she called Camilla and she asked her, "Hey, have you talked to Renee tonight? Because I can't get in touch with her." And Camilla would tell Teresa that actually, yeah, I just got a very strange text message from her that just said, "I love you, I'm sorry." And so at this point, the two women understood that there could be something very wrong with Renee. And so they met up and drove all around Sydney, going to all the places that Renee was known to go to. But after several hours of looking and not hearing back from Renee, they really didn't know what to do. And so the two women drove back to Teresa's house, so Renee's house, and they went inside and they sat down. And at that point, Teresa's husband and the rest of Renee's siblings, they were all there, and everyone's just kind of sitting around wondering what to do next, when around 9:30 at night, they heard a knock on the door. And it was the police coming to inform them that they had found Renee's car parked in an area that it shouldn't have been, but Renee wasn't there. And so they were coming to ask if they knew where she was and why her car might be out there. And so at this point, the family is totally terrified. They tell the police about these strange text messages, and then before long, the parents just rush outside, they hop in their cars, and they drive out to where their daughter's car is. And where Renee's car was parked was in an area called The Gap. It basically was this sheer cliff overlooking the ocean. The parents got out and they searched their daughter's car, but there was no sign of where she had gone based on the car. And so they began running up and down the cliffs. There was a sidewalk that kind of ran parallel to the edge of the cliff. And they're running up and down, hoping they're going to find their daughter, but there's no sign of her. And then at some point, Teresa climbed up to one of the highest points of the cliff. And when she got up there, she found her daughter's black flat shoes. And they were placed neatly together on the ground right in front of the fence that was there to prevent people from getting too close to the edge of the cliff. But despite an extensive search that night, they couldn't find any sign of Renee. She was nowhere to be found. However, the police would discover the following day that there was actually a camera that was looking at that section of the cliffs. And so they reviewed this footage and they found Renee. They saw what happened to her. And in this camera footage, you see Renee walking up the trail in the middle of the night, and she stops and she takes off her shoes and she puts them down, and then she hops over that fence. Now, the fence was not right up against the very edge of the cliff. It was set back maybe 3 or 4 feet. And so she hops over the fence, and then she steps very carefully to the edge of the cliff, and she kind of peeks over the edge and then looks visibly terrified, and she moves backwards a few steps until her back is pressed up against the fence. And then she pulls out her phone and she sends 3 text messages. One was to her mother, which is the text about how she loved her and she was sorry for the pain she was going to cause her. And then the other 2 text messages were to Camilla and also to Braden. However, to this day, we don't actually know what either of those text messages said. And then after sending these 3 text messages, Renee takes her phone and she throws it off the cliff into the water. And then she sat down and began kind of shimmying herself forward towards the edge. Now, the camera did not actually pick her up falling off the cliff, but it's assumed when she went out of frame that she had fallen off the cliff to her death. Her body would never be recovered. Renee's death was ruled a suicide. However, her family, in addition to being totally devastated by this horrible loss, they felt totally confused. They had no idea why this had happened, but they were certain it had to have something to do with this recent breakup with Braden Spiteri. And so they tried to get in touch with Braden, but he wasn't getting back in touch with them. And so the family contacted the police and said, "Can you reach out to the prison where he is and set up a meeting?" And so the police obliged them and they called Goulburn Prison. And when they spoke to the prison, they said, "Who? Braden who? Yeah, we don't have a Braden Spiteri here. We never have." And the reason was, Braden Spiteri wasn't real. Renee's friend, Camilla, had made him up. He was a fictitious person. That picture of Braden Spiteri where Camilla is laying on his shoulder, that was just some random person she had met in a club. Camilla had always been very possessive of Renee ever since they had met in high school, and at some point, she had just decided that she wanted even more control over Renee. And so the first thing she did is she convinced Renee that her earlier boyfriend, the one she'd been dating for 2 years before Braden, she convinced Renee that he had been cheating on her the whole time, he was unfaithful, that he didn't love her, and then she had created those text messages and given them to Renee and convinced Renee that that was something he had said, and before long, Renee totally believed it. She approached her boyfriend, he denied it, but Camilla the whole time is telling Renee, "He's lying to you, he's been doing this whole time, I know he's a bad guy." And so Renee had listened to her best friend and she had severed that relationship. And then almost immediately after that, Camilla swoops in to the rescue and connects Renee with this Braden guy, Camilla's supposed ex-boyfriend, who really was just Camilla on the other side of the phone. And for nearly 2 years, Camilla kept this charade up. And Renee completely believed this was a real person, that Braden was her boyfriend. She loved him. And eventually, in June of 2013, so 2 months before Renee died, she confided in Braden, aka Camilla, that her friend Camilla was toxic and mean and controlling and she didn't want to be her friend anymore. And so Camilla, she's reading this and she's furious. And so she decides the only way to get revenge on Renee and regain control of her is to have Braden break up with her. And so 2 months later, on August 5th, 2013, so on the day that Renee died, she was out to lunch at around 1 p.m. with a coworker when she gets a text message from Braden that just kind of comes out of the blue, and it says, "I need a break from you." Now, this is around the time that they're planning their wedding. And so Renee is totally heartbroken and she's trying to get in touch with him and call him. He's not picking up. And then fast forward to about 2:45 p.m. that afternoon, we know Renee called Goulburn Prison. It was the first time she had done that. Now, we don't know who she spoke to or what they actually talked about, but it's nearly guaranteed that she learned Braden Spiteri was not being held there. And so almost certainly she would have realized that Braden is either not real or Braden had been lying to her in such a huge way that the relationship could never work. And so no matter what, this chapter of her life was totally over. And so later that day, when she was sitting on her bed in her bedroom and her mom came in and she asked her how she was doing, it's very likely that Renee was devastated. She was crushed and probably kind of embarrassed about how badly she had just been duped by this Braden person, whoever that was. And so even though normally Renee would tell her mother everything, her mother was her confidant, she loved her mother, it was like she just couldn't bring herself to discuss what was happening to her. It was just so enormous, it was so overwhelming that she hid it from her mother. And instead, she just got dressed up, said goodbye to her mom, and then she headed out to the cliffs. No charges were ever brought against Camilla because catfishing, which is exactly what she was doing, which is using a fictitious online persona to lure people into relationships, well, that's not considered a crime in Australia. And Camilla, despite being pressed by the police and Renee's family, has never taken responsibility for this and has never apologized. The next and final story of today's episode is called The Man in Cobb Park. In 2001, Greg Biggs was a 37-year-old self-employed bricklayer who was living in a homeless shelter in Fort Worth, Texas. He was also the father of one child. He had an 18-year-old son named Brandon who lived with Greg's ex-wife. Despite not living with his son while his son grew up, Greg had always made a point of spending lots of time with Brandon, and so over the years, they had become quite close. But besides his son, Greg really struggled to build meaningful long-term relationships with other people. It was like no matter how friendly and outgoing he was, people would just come into Greg's life and would leave very, very quickly. This made Greg, who always had struggled with his mental health, feel very isolated and lonely and desperate for human interaction. And so on the rare occasion where people did come into Greg's life, a new friend or a new love interest, he was always so excited to try to please them and keep them around that he would often go overboard with his generosity and his willingness to do things for these people to the point where he really set himself up for being taken advantage of. Case in point, 2 years earlier, a woman had kind of suddenly come into Greg's life, and Greg very quickly fell in love with her. And early on in their relationship, this woman tells Greg that she's struggling financially. And without any hesitation, Greg started giving her all of his money. Now, Greg was not a wealthy man, not by a long shot, and so before long, he had literally given this woman all of his money to the point where Greg could no longer make truck payments, he couldn't make house payments, and so his vehicle and his home were repossessed. And then after he's suddenly homeless and destitute, this woman who he's given all his money to, she also disappears. But despite being in this horrible situation of sudden homelessness, Greg made the best of it. Anytime Greg was not working, he would be trying to make plans with his son Brandon to go walk around the mall downtown or go see a cheap afternoon movie. Times were definitely tough for Greg, but Greg stayed positive. He was a forever optimist, and he did this by focusing on the future. He was certain if he could just land a few more good-paying gigs, he could make that extra cash and finally buy a home again and buy a vehicle again and finally kind of get his life back together. But unfortunately, he would never get that chance. On the morning of October 27, 2001, two men called the Fort Worth Police Department to report having seen something suspicious on a park bench inside of Cobb Park. Cobb Park is this big public park with playgrounds and walking trails and fields, and at the time, Cobb Park was not considered a very safe place to be, especially after hours. There was lots of shady people in the park. So when the Fort Worth Police Department gets a call about something shady happening in Cobb Park, they aren't surprised. And so they dispatch a single detective to go over to the park and meet these two guys and see whatever suspicious thing is on this park bench. And so this detective, he goes over to the gates of Cobb Park, he meets these two guys, and they kind of explain what they saw. They give him directions to this bench, and then he thanks them, he hops back in his cruiser, he drives through the gates, and he starts driving down the trail, and then he pulls off and parks his cruiser, knowing that the bench in question is right around the corner, maybe 200 or 300 feet away. And so he parks his cruiser, he gets out, and he starts walking on this cement path, and as he's walking, he can't see the bench yet, but as he's walking, he sees there are deep tire tracks in the grass and mud off to the right side of the walking path. So he's mentally kind of taking note that somebody had been driving inside the park fairly recently off the trail. And so he keeps on walking and he begins to make that turn and he sees up ahead the bench in question and he can clearly see these deep tire tracks go right up to the bench. And then as he begins to make that turn and he's maybe 30 or 40 feet away, he can actually see what's on this bench. And he can see this big lump that's kind of wrapped up in what looks like a rug or a blanket. And then as he gets closer and closer, he can finally see that very clearly there is a person inside of this blanket that's kind of laying out on this bench. And when he's about 10 or 15 feet away, he can see it's a man, and this man is clearly deceased. So this detective, he walks right over to the bench and he's looking down at this body and he can see the right arm on this guy is very badly broken and his right leg is also very badly broken. And then his left leg is not only broken, but it's been partially amputated. In fact, the left leg is barely hanging on. And so this detective, he's looking at this guy thinking, okay, this person must have gotten wrapped up in these shady criminal dealings that are known to take place in Cobb Park, and somebody beat him to death, or they beat him and then shot him to death. But as he's looking at the body, despite these extensive injuries, the bruising on his body was not consistent with someone who had been beaten to death. And in terms of potentially being shot to death, he began looking at the body, and from where he was standing, he could not see an entrance or an exit wound of a bullet. And so stumped, the detective steps back and is just kind of pondering what he's looking at when he realizes there's very little blood anywhere near the bench or on the body, and considering the left leg has been nearly amputated, you would think there would be lots and lots of blood, but there wasn't. And so that indicated to the detective that his injuries had to have been sustained elsewhere. And so this detective, he calls in backup and more detectives show up and they're all kind of looking at the scene, and the working theory became, okay, this guy got killed outside of the park. We don't know how he got killed. It looks like some sort of blunt force trauma, but somehow he gets killed outside of the park, and then his killers, they drive him into Cobb Park, which is why you have those deep tire tracks on the right side of the path, and they dump him on this bench. Later that day, the medical examiner would come out and positively identify the body as belonging to Greg Biggs. The same day that Greg was found, the police went out and began their investigation, and they started by interviewing people that had been in Cobb Park either that day or in recent days, and they also interviewed known criminals that they knew went into Cobb Park, and they reviewed CCTV footage both in the park and outside of the park. But no one knew anything about what happened to Greg, and the footage didn't show them anything interesting. And so very quickly, Greg's case began to languish, and no one knew what to make of it. Then, in February of 2002, so roughly 4 months after Greg was found, the Fort Worth Police Department received a phone call. It was from this young woman named Miranda Daniel, and she said, "I know what happened to the man in Cobb Park." And the story she would tell them at first was so hard to believe that the Fort Worth Police Department weren't sure if this was a prank or not. But when they followed up on her lead and they went to a very specific address that she had mentioned, they realized she was telling the truth. This is the unbelievable true story of what happened to Greg Biggs. On the evening of October 25th, 2001, so 36 hours before Greg was found in Cobb Park, 25-year-old nurse's assistant Shantae Mallard arrived at her friend's apartment in Fort Worth, Texas. Her friend was named Titalisi Rice. She went by T-Fry. Shantae was from a very loving and stable household in Fort Worth, Texas. Her parents had raised her to be kind to other people and to always work hard and to stay out of trouble, and by and large, Shantae acted accordingly. But in her late teens and early 20s, Shantae began to secretly rebel against her parents. On the surface, when she was around her parents and her family, she was the goody two-shoes that always followed the rules. But when she was away from her family, specifically when she was with T-Fry, she would let her wild, rebellious side out. The two friends had met in 1999 at a nursing home where they both worked as nursing assistants. T-Fry had just gotten out of this very toxic marriage, and so when she met Shantae, she was actively looking for someone to go out and party with and go be free and meet other new people. And Shantae, when she's meeting T-Fry, she didn't necessarily know she wanted to do those things, but being around T-Fry, it was like this whole other side of life was opened up to her, and suddenly all she wanted was to go cut loose with T-Fry. And so very quickly, these two women really connected over their mutual desire to go have fun at any cost. And before long, they were not only drinking and doing drugs and partying on the weekends, but they were also getting high before work, which meant they were treating patients high. So with that in mind, fast forward back to October 25th, and Shantae has just arrived at T-Fry's apartment. And so Shantae, she goes up to T-Fry's apartment, and the two start drinking some alcohol, and they start smoking some weed, and they split an ecstasy pill. Ecstasy is a big party drug. It's kind of like a cross between being a stimulant and a psychedelic. And so after these two women are fairly buzzed on these different substances and they're feeling ready to go, they leave T-Fry's apartment, they go down and they climb into Shantae's car. And Shantae drives the two of them to a local club called Joe's Big Bamboo. And so the plan was they were going to meet this guy named Cleet Jackson, who was Shantae's love interest. And the plan was they would hang out at the club with Cleet, and then at the end of the night, they would all leave, and Shantae and Cleet were going to spend the night together. And so Shantae and T-Fry, they arrive in the parking lot of Joe's Big Bamboo. They park their car, they get out, and they meet up with Cleet, who was outside of the club. And the trio kind of sneak off from the rest of the people trying to get into the club, and they smoke some more marijuana. And then the trio, they go into the club, and they start having drinks, and they're partying, and they're dancing, and they're having this great time. And then at some point in the night, Cleet kind of abandons Shantae and T-Fry, and he goes off with another woman he met that night in the club, and he would actually leave the club with this other woman, and he would vanish for the night. And so around 2 a.m., when the club is getting ready to close, Shantae realizes that Cleet, the guy she was going to go home with, he's gone now. And so she's very frustrated, but she doesn't really have any recourse. And so she instead just goes and finds T-Fry and says, hey, let's just leave. And T-Fry, she's ready to leave too. And so the two women, they leave the club and they get out to Shantae's car, and both women are clearly under the influence. They're both definitely inebriated, but T-Fry believed she was less inebriated than Shantae was, and so she should drive. And so she told Shantae, get in the passenger seat, I'm gonna drive. Shantae gets into the passenger seat, T-Fry gets in the driver's seat, and she leaves the club and she drives all the way back to her apartment. When she parks at her apartment, she gets out and says to Shantae, hey, I don't mind getting in my car and kind of trailing you as you drive back to your home to make sure you get home safe, kind of like an escort. And Shantae, she just gets out of the passenger side and walks right around and confidently sits in the driver's seat of her car and tells T-Fry, nope, I'm fine, I'm gonna drive myself, I'll see you later. And then Shantae drove away. About an hour later, at 3:30 in the morning, T-Fry is in bed in her apartment when she gets this very frantic phone call from Shantae, who's totally hysterical, she's beside herself, and she's not really making any sense, but she's trying to get T-Fry to come over to her house. Now, T-Fry did attempt to figure out what was going on, but she just could not cut through the hysteria on the other side of the phone, and so eventually T-Fry just thought, you know what, clearly it's something serious, I'm gonna go see what's going on. And so T-Fry, she leaves her apartment, she gets in her car, and she drives over to Shantae's house. And when she gets there, she goes up to the front door, she opens it up, she walks inside, and she finds Shantae in the kitchen straight ahead. She's totally hysterical, she's crying, and she's telling T-Fry that she didn't mean to do it, she's so sorry. And T-Fry's telling her, hey, calm down, what's going on? And Shantae says, look in the garage. And so T-Fry, she walks straight ahead through the kitchen to the door in the kitchen that leads into Shantae's garage. And she opens the door up, she turns the light on, and in the middle of the garage is Shantae's car. It had been parked nose in and lodged head first in the windshield on the passenger side of this car was Greg Biggs. When Shantae had left T-Fry's house an hour earlier saying she was fine to drive, on her drive home, she had barreled into Greg, who was on a sidewalk of some street, and the impact was so hard that Greg went flying through the windshield and got lodged halfway inside of her car. But the impact didn't kill him. It did almost cut his left leg off and break several bones in his body, but it didn't kill him. In fact, there was blood spatter inside of the car on the passenger side that indicated Greg was totally conscious and was trying to pull himself back into the car. There were these handprints on the inside of the passenger side door, indicating Greg had been pulling on them. There was also these very small droplets of blood all over the seat, indicating that Greg had been spitting up blood as he was trying to talk to Shantae or as he was trying to plead for help. But Shantae, instead of stopping her car and getting this guy help, she just kept on driving home with Greg lodged in her front windshield. Now keep in mind, where she hit him, she was less than a half mile from the fire station where her brother, her older brother, was currently on duty as a fireman. He was medically trained. He could have saved Greg's life. Also, the other firemen at the firehouse that she knew, that Shantae knew, they could have saved Greg's life. Also, less than 6 miles away from the point of impact was the local hospital, where of course they could have saved Greg's life. And then on her drive all the way back to her house with Greg halfway in her windshield, she would have passed by 9 payphones, where if you don't know anything about payphones, you can dial 911, so emergency services, and it doesn't charge you anything. So Shantae at any one of these payphones could have called medical personnel who could have saved Greg. Also, let's not forget, Shantae was medically trained. She was a nurse's assistant and understood basic life-saving. But she did not use any of those resources. Instead, she just drove home. And when she got to her home, she drove her car with Greg in it into her garage. She shut the garage door. She gets out, and as Greg is literally moaning and probably pleading for help at this point, she just says, "I'm sorry," and then walks up to the door that leads into the kitchen of her home. She turns off the light in the garage, walks into her kitchen, and shuts the door behind her, trapping Greg in the garage in total darkness by himself. Then, after an hour of Shantae just being in her house with Greg slowly dying in the garage, she calls T-Fry. T-Fry comes over, she looks in the garage, she sees Greg, and T-Fry's reaction is she just totally loses it. She panics and she's screaming at Shantae, call 911, call paramedics, call the police. But Shantae refused. She didn't really give a reason, but she just said, no, I can't. And then shockingly, T-Fry also does not call anyone. The two of them just turn off the garage light again and shut the door and leave Greg, and they hop into T-Fry's car and they drive to T-Fry's apartment where they sleep for several hours. And then when they get up that morning, they go back over to Shantae's house and they check on Greg, who's now motionless. And at this point, Shantae, she calls Cleet Jackson, the guy who she was supposed to go home with at the club but had abandoned her for some other girl. She calls him and says, hey, I have this huge problem. I need you to come help me. And so Cleet Jackson has no idea what he's walking into, but he goes to her house and he goes through her kitchen. She opens the door and he looks into the garage and he sees Greg in the window, and he's furious with Shantae because now he's gotten involved and he doesn't really know if Greg's alive and he doesn't really know what to do because he's on parole. And if he gets wrapped up in this, he'll go back to jail. But he ultimately decides he's just going to help Shantae because he believes at this point Greg is dead. So there's nothing they can do to save Greg. And so that night, Cleet gets in touch with his cousin Tyrone, and the two of them, they go into the garage and they lay out a carpet next to the car, and they both kind of awkwardly apologize to Greg, who's just stuck in the windowsill, and they yank him out, they put him into the carpet, they roll him up, they put him in the back of one of their cars, and they drive to Cobb Park. They go through the gates, they make their way over to that bench, and they drop him on the bench. There had been some discussion about maybe destroying the body, burning the body, but Cleet felt strongly that they need to put his body out somewhere in public so at least his family can identify him and bury him. After his body was placed in the park, Shantae told Cleet and Tyrone and T-Fry not to tell anyone, and they said they wouldn't. And within a week of Greg's body being discovered, Shantae was back at Joe's Big Bamboo partying it up as if nothing had ever happened. But eventually, T-Fry would tell a couple of her friends, and before long, word had gotten out. And one person found out about it that was kind of in the network of these people, this woman, Miranda Daniels, and she really didn't like Shantae. And so she was the one who actually called the police and turned her in. And when the Fort Worth police followed up on Miranda's tip and they went to Shantae's house, they went into her garage, and there was her car with the windshield still obviously busted in from something being smashed through it, and there's blood all over the inside of the car, and there was some obvious attempts at trying to destroy evidence inside of the car. The seats had been taken out, some things had been burned, but none of the attempts Shantae had made had actually destroyed any of the evidence. During the trial, the medical examiner who had done the autopsy on Greg Biggs said his injuries would not have killed him right away. Now, he didn't know for sure how long he would have been alive, but he believed it could be as long as several hours or maybe even up to a whole day. And during that time, Greg was just trapped inside of this pitch black garage. No one's coming to help him, despite people coming in over and over again that he's pleading with to help him. And he would have been in excruciating pain. He's got several significant broken bones, his leg has been nearly amputated, he's got cuts all over his body, and he would have been trying to pull himself out of the windshield, and every movement he was making would have been sending the jagged pieces of metal and glass into his body. I mean, this is a drawn-out, horrible death. And during the trial, every single medical professional and every single law enforcement official said, had Shantae brought Greg to get medical attention at any point in the first couple of hours, just basic medical care, he would have lived. And so his death is entirely because of Shantae's absolute indifference. T-Fry would ultimately, in exchange for full immunity, testify against Shantae, and Shantae would ultimately be found guilty of murder of Greg Biggs, and she would be sentenced to 50 years in prison. She'll be eligible for parole in 2027. As for Cleet Jackson and his cousin Tyrone, they received 10 years and 9 years respectively for their role in the crime. During the victim impact statement portion of the trial, Brandon Biggs, Greg's son, he took the stand and he very eloquently told Shantae that he forgave her, and it seemed very genuine and it moved Shantae to tears. And then Brandon looked out at the audience where Shantae's family was and he said, you know, not only do I feel horrible for my family, but I feel bad for your family, Shantae, as well, because this crime has destroyed all of us. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please hold the 5-star review button at gunpoint and then force them to walk through puddles in their socks. Also, please subscribe to the Mr. Ballin podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories I have posted on my YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform